So my other video on Romans 10, particularly the heart and mouth language, was echoing because I wasn't using a microphone, admittedly. So I wanted to make another video with the proper equipment so that I can show you and that it would be easier to understand and to hear. Um, Basically, when we're going through verses 6 through 10, you will notice that, and really we'll put in verse 5 too, because we have to understand the word righteousness. When we go through verses 6 and 10 through 10, we will see the heart and mouth language and how it's interactive, meaning that the mouth and the heart are used together. And the reason this is important is not only to understand the content of the gospel being presented here, specifically to unbelieving Jews that represent the remaining national Israel of Paul's day, but also understanding the contextual background that Paul is using, specifically in verse 10 when he says, "And with the mouth confession is made unto salvation." He is hinting the reader that something else is going on here, and which is extremely important because in Paul's day we were dealing with the upcoming wrath of God. Now, that wrath was going to be exercised through what we understand as the day of the Lord. The day of the Lord has not happened yet, but see, this is the revelation of understanding these things and how, since we are in the church age, we are looking for that day of the Lord, and specifically we're looking for that dispensational shift between the church age and Daniel's 70th week. So that puts into perspective Acts 2 as well, because Peter was preaching the same thing. We have both verses in verse 21, calling upon the name of the Lord shall be saved, and verse 13 in Romans 10. So the same context is at play here. But I wanted to show you, of course, in my other video where I make the distinctions between the types of salvations, where verse 10 is not the same salvation as verse 13, although they share the same contextual background, because Paul is trying to lead you to that because of the understanding of the current times that they were in, and indeed the future times that they will be in, specifically what Zechariah 13 talks about, and what Joel 2 talks about. So just starting here, we will do a brief exegesis. Beginning in verse 5, "For Moses describeth the righteousness which is of the law, that the man which doeth those things shall live by them." And so there was only one man that was able to fulfill that, and that was Jesus Christ. And when we get to verse 6, "But the righteousness which is of faith speaketh on this wise." Wise meaning on this particular matter, this thing, this context. And so, "Say not in thine heart, who shall ascend into heaven?" And in parentheses here, Paul is telling you what he is saying as a believer. That is, seeing, in other words, because he's speaking to Christians, to bring Christ down from above. So this makes sense. He's not speaking to unbelievers. Unbelievers wouldn't understand this parenthetical reference here. But again, in verse 1, "Brethren, my heart's desire and prayer to God for Israel is that they might be saved." And now, brethren could be a reference to his Jewish blood, but the fact is that the they, he is speaking to Israel as a they. So if these were unbelievers he was talking to, he would say something that you might be saved, or even as if he's putting himself into that group, that we might be saved, although Paul was a believer, so that wouldn't make sense. So you would most likely see that you might be saved. No, he's saying that they might be saved. So he's using a different group there. And we have brethren here. So he's talking about the remaining portion of national Israel that's not saved. So this context here in Romans 10 is talking about eternal salvation. So in verse 6, that is to bring Christ down from above. "Say not in thine heart, who shall ascend into heaven." You don't say that because God came down from above. It was Jesus Christ. The unbelieving Jews didn't believe it was God. That's the point that Paul's making. So who shall ascend into heaven? That is to bring Christ down from above. Jesus Christ already came down from above. So this isn't something that we need to do here. But say not in thine heart, So don't say in your heart, who shall go into heaven? Christ already came. So the opposite of that is to say in your heart that Jesus Christ came down from above, that God came down from above. So you will notice how that is a confession of verse 9. That if thou shalt confess with thy mouth the Lord Jesus. If you were to follow what Paul's saying here in verse 6, the unbelieving Jew was to believe verse 6 here, you would be making a confession that Jesus Christ is Lord. So in verse 7, or, meaning on the other part of the content, who shall descend into the deep, that is to bring up Christ again from the dead. Now again, we looked at Deuteronomy 30, verses 11 through 14, and how that's a parallel. If you haven't seen that, please go watch my other video on that. But he's pulling from Deuteronomy 30 to make his point here. So this is pertaining to the resurrection. Who shall descend into the deep? We don't have to ask that question because Christ descended into the deep. See again, in parentheses, Paul is saying, that is to bring up Christ again from the dead, because this is what Paul believes and this is what he's telling. So he is preaching to a Jewish congregation that has converted to Christianity, but he is talking about the remaining fraction of national Israel that is lost. Verse 8, but what saith it? What saith these things? It's the Word. The Word says it. The Word is nigh thee, even in thy mouth. Even meaning specifically, the Word is nigh thee. It is specifically in their mouth and in thy heart. That is, see that again? That is, verse 6, that is, verse 7. That is the word of faith which we preach. So the word of faith is the gospel. That you have to believe in that. And so what's happening here is that you're seeing the mouth and the heart being taken together. Even in thy mouth and in thy heart. That is the word of faith. So both the mouth and the heart are equivalent to the word of faith which we preach. See the interactive language? Which is of faith speaketh on this wise. Say not in thine heart. And what saith it? The word is nigh thee, even in thy mouth. The word of faith which we preach. You preach with your mouth. So then, again, we have verse 9, clause A, which is formed by verse 6. It is a confession that Jesus Christ is Lord. They had to believe that Jesus Christ is God, and they had to believe that he rose again from the dead. Those are the two core essentials that national Israel denied. They denied that Jesus Christ was the Messiah, and they denied that he rose again from the dead. They didn't deny that he died on a cross, because they nailed him to a cross. So these are the two essential elements. Saving faith, the content, and when I say saving faith, I'm not talking about certain things that you have to do. I'm using that in the sense of the content that you have to believe to be saved. And so in this context in Romans 10, those are the things that the unbelieving Jew needed to believe. You will see the same content in Acts chapter 2, which was a Jewish festival, Pentecost. The same two things were preached. The blood atonement is nowhere in there. The blood atonement is nowhere in this chapter either, because the Jew understood the blood atonement. The issue was whether or not Christ was that blood atonement, and they denied that he was. So you see there's not an emphasis on the blood atonement here. And that's strictly because the Jews understood that. Now when you go and preach to the Gentile, as Paul did, he went and preached to the Gentiles, you will see the blood atonement listed there because the Gentile didn't have knowledge of those things. Those people, those Gentiles were lost. They were not proselytes. And they were proselytes at Pentecost, so they understood those things. So these saved Jews here in Romans 10 that Paul is speaking to, not about, but speaking to, could understand the parallel of Deuteronomy 30 here. For with the heart man believeth unto righteousness, and with the mouth confession is made unto salvation. So unto meanings in reference to righteousness. So you believe to become righteous. So here we have the mouth confession. That means to get that salvation. It's not because of that salvation. It's not saying that it's a reflection of your salvation. You have to read unto here in the same verse in the same way. Unto righteousness, and with the mouth confession is made unto salvation. Righteousness and salvation occur together. You're made righteous and you're saved. That occurs together. So there's no problem here with using unto, meaning to get that thing. The problem is how we develop, one, the sinner's prayer, that you have to confess with your literal mouth. Those are people that don't understand the analogy Paul's using here. And number two, they make it equivalent to verse 13, calling upon the name of the Lord. Calling and confessing are different here. And so what's happening is you have the heart and the mouth being used as a vehicle for obtaining the gospel content. Because again, the word is nigh thee, even in thy mouth and in thy heart. That is the word of faith which we preach. And notice how in verse 9, confession is listed first. So if we're talking about a reflection of the mouth being a reflection of your salvation, verse 9 lists that confession first. That doesn't make sense from a soteriological standpoint. But Paul flips that verse here because he's leading you into that background, that contextual background, that Israel, once they are saved, are going to call Jesus Christ back. And it's going to be, they're going to be praying. It's going to be a national prayer to deliver them, specifically from the Antichrist kingdom. That was the warning in the Olivet Discourse that Jesus Christ was giving once the abomination of desolation is committed. Different conversation. But the point is that we're looking at the heart and the mouth being used together and how that shows a salvation, an eternal salvation. The heart, you believe the resurrection. The mouth, you believe that Jesus Christ is the Messiah. That is the gospel for the unbelieving Jew in the first century. And that is the same gospel preached, the personal gospel, in Acts 2. So when we get to verse 11, for the scripture saith, whosoever believeth. See, we're not going from a physical salvation with the mouth back to believing here. This is eternal salvation. And I'm going to do another video on how verse 10 is not teaching sanctification from God's wrath. That is not what's happening, because in summation, we are not appointed to wrath. And I will give you several scriptures to back this up. And national destruction and the wrath of God go together because it's exercised upon unbelievers. But we clearly have believers here at this point, for with the heart man believeth unto righteousness. So if this is talking about sanctification from God's wrath, that would mean that God's wrath is exercised upon believers, and that's simply not biblical, in my opinion. So my interpretation is that this is talking about eternal salvation, but is a contextual background that is using the same syntax for verse 13. Verse 14 clarifies this. How then shall they call on him of whom they have not believed? So the believing is what happens first. Same thing happens first in verse 10, and the calling happens second. So the mouth confessions made unto salvation is a typology of verse 13, but the context in verse 10 is eternal salvation. So the person is becoming saved here. This is a lost person becoming saved. So when you get down to verse 13, it makes perfect sense. These are saved people who will call upon the name of the Lord. So I hope this makes it better to understand. And this is pretty much just starting from verse 5 with a few points here and there in the rest of the chapter on how we can understand the mouth and heart language in Romans 10. I appreciate your time in listening to this, and God bless.